Welcome to Sunday Sermons from the Williamsburg Community Chapel, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Matthew, chapter 4, verses 12 through 25. And I'll read verses 13 through 16 for us now, as we prepare to hear from Hunter Ruch as he helps us continue in our Lenten series titled, The New Exodus. And leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. And for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned.
2 weeks ago, Travis shared a story at the start of the sermon about a mission trip that he took to Nicaragua with some folks from his alma mater, the College of William and Mary, and some folks from my alma mater, the University of Virginia. And Travis shared that there was a connection between the spelling of UVA, which happens just to be the Spanish word for grape. And Travis was quite pleased to share this story, pointing out that the reason why Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia was because his children could not get into the College of William and Mary. And he opened the door for a response. Now, Travis, I will say that of all of the William and Mary graduates that I talk with, you are one of the most mindful of the fact that Thomas Jefferson graduated from your alma mater. And he likes to point that out to me. My response to Travis often is, well, Travis, you know, at the time, Thomas Jefferson's options were quite limited. And what does this have to do with the sermon? Well, I suppose if we are living east of Eden, in keeping with the John Steinbeck references, then you can consider this retort the grape of wrath. Now, I imagine that Travis was listening intently to that story because he knew he was involved in the story. And maybe if you are a graduate of William and Mary or the University of Virginia, you also listened a little bit to that story because you felt like you had a connection. You could sense that you were a part of the story, and so you were listening intently. I think that this ties into our theme with our series here of the new Exodus that we have been in, because we all want to know that we are part of a story. We all want to know what is our role in the story. We sense that we are part of something bigger than ourselves, and we long to know that for sure. Our text today from Matthew chapter 4 actually shows us in subtle and yet still dramatic ways that we are all part of the story of the new Exodus, and that has been God's plan from the very beginning. As we have noted in this season of Lent, we have been working through this series, the new Exodus, from the very beginning of Matthew's gospel as well as at the end of Matthew's gospel. And to help us on our journey throughout the week, I hope that you have been taking advantage of our Lent reading plan as we've been looking at different teaching segments of Jesus throughout Matthew's gospel. Pick one up in the Welcome Center or the Welcome Desk, and you will be blessed to read through Matthew chapter 13 this coming week. In our sermons, we have been learning how Matthew is telling Israel's story and our story and Jesus' story as well. And we've been following Jesus on the movements of this new Exodus, which mirror the movements of the people of Israel in the first Exodus. Jesus has moved out of Egypt in chapter 2, through the water at his baptism in chapter 3, and finally into the wilderness with his temptation in chapter 4. And we are learning to learn the story in order to live the story. And I would add to that today, listen to the story. Now, today's text from Matthew chapter 4 is interesting as we think about Jesus going beyond the Jordan, because the pattern of the Israelites in the wilderness on their exodus seems to be broken a bit here, because at no point in the Israelites' journeys do they find themselves in the region where Jesus finds himself today. It is almost as if Matthew is pausing the story to recap and reorient us to the story of Israel and to that of Jesus, while showing us how our stories all intersect with one another. And the main idea that I share today from Matthew chapter 4 is that Jesus journeyed beyond the Jordan so that we could join the story of the new Exodus. It is a story of salvation and grace that both Jew and Gentile are invited to participate in through Jesus Christ. A simple structure for our text today from Matthew 4:12 through 25 could be the setting, which is far north, the partnership involving fishermen, and finally the impact, which is fame. We begin with the setting of far north as we look at verses 12 through 17 of our text from Matthew chapter 4. Now when he, that is Jesus, heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. That term for arrested is the same word that's used of when Jesus is betrayed and arrested by Judas later in the gospel. What Matthew wants to show us is that the ministry of John the Baptist is now done. He is the forerunner announcing the arrival of the king, and the king is now here. And so the real beginning of Jesus' public ministry now happens in this moment. A new era has arrived because the Messiah, or the King, has come. We continue reading that leaving Nazareth, he went in and lived in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. What is interesting is that Jesus seems to withdraw, maybe wanting to get a little distance from the religious leaders, or maybe getting some distance from Herod Antipas, who was the ruler over the territory at the time. But he doesn't go to a remote place. He goes to a more populated place, actually. He moves from Nazareth to Capernaum, which is about a 20-mile distance. And he's in this region known as Galilee, which is in the northern part of the ancient land of Israel. It's about over 12,000 square miles, I should say, and has over 200 villages. And some people estimate that there may have been about 3 million people living in and around this region of Galilee at the time. So he moves from a small town and he goes into a larger town and larger area. And just to show this, because it's so important in any Bible study, we do have a map which will indicate where Jesus was in Nazareth, moving to Capernaum on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee, which would become one of Jesus' favorite classrooms for the discipleship of his followers. Galilee itself was along one of the oldest trade routes in the ancient world, known as the Way of the Sea. It went from Damascus in the north in Syria all the way down to Egypt. And so Galilee was right in the path of this major trade route. And it had a very, especially in Capernaum, it had a very robust fishing industry. Now, the people of Galilee were not soft. These are a people who had been used and abused by Gentile nations time and time again. This is the same region that overlaps, as we see these two words, the original allotment given to the tribe of Zebulun and the tribe of Naphtali in the ancient world when the Israelites settled in the Promised Land. Again, these people were a rough and rugged bunch. They were open to and eager for change. They were denounced by their Jewish brethren in the south in Judea, and they were tired of centuries of oppression by Gentile rulers. In other words, their region and their culture had been chewed up and spit out by enemy nations over and over, bringing false practices, false religion to God's people. And they had dwelt in darkness and in the shadow of death for far too long. And they were ready for the Messiah, which probably explains why Jesus chose to begin his public ministry in this area. As we turn back to the text, we can begin to see how Israel's story and Jesus' story really connect as we look at a quotation from the Old Testament. Picking up in verse 14, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. We'll come back to that phrase at the end, Galilee of the Gentiles. Just make a mental note. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and those dwelling in the region and the shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. What Matthew is doing here is he is quoting directly from the Old Testament prophet Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. In this original context of Isaiah chapter 9, the people of the northern kingdom of Israel are under the oppression of the Assyrian army that is threatening to take them into an exile and to defeat them. And God's word to them is, even if this does happen to you, do not worry. I will send a great deliverer, a great Messiah, and he will come in the future, and he will bring you home. We're actually pretty familiar with this story because a few verses later in Isaiah 9, we read that this Messiah would be a child born unto us. The government would be on his shoulders. He would be a wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, who would rule on the throne of his kingdom in perfect righteousness, justice, and peace forever. We know, of course, that this king is Jesus Christ himself. And the motif of the people being oppressed by foreign government is continuing here with the people of Galilee, not by the Assyrians now, but by the Romans. And so Jesus now begins this new phase of his ministry. But the deliverance that he came to offer would be much more than political. And the expanse of his kingdom would be much more than something geographical. He would bring salvation and life, and he would bring light to an otherwise dark and hopeless situation. This is consistent with the ministry of Jesus, the person of Jesus as the Son of God. I'm reminded of verses such as John chapter 1, verses 4 through 5, where we read about Jesus. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then John 8:12. Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. But what we need to observe is that this hope, this salvation, this light, this life found in Jesus was not intended just for the people of Israel alone. In noting that Jesus' ministry begins in Galilee, Galilee of the Gentiles, in fact, Matthew wants to show us an important part of the new Exodus story that we will come back to. This ministry, this story, this kingdom was open to all people of all nations. And in order to experience the benefits of this story and this kingdom and this salvation, the message that Jesus gives in verse 17 is simple. As he began to preach, saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. This, friends, is the very same message that John the Baptist, one chapter earlier, had preached. The very same words. It's almost as if Matthew, under the Spirit, copied and pasted John's words and applied them now to Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. This was Jesus' very first sermon in the Gospel of Matthew. Needless to say, it's slightly shorter, but significantly more important than the sermon you are hearing today. But these were his first sermon words. The kingdom of heaven itself refers to the rule of God himself over creation and over the hearts of people and in their lives. It's a realm and it's a reality that's defined by God's truth, God's values, and God, his very self. One author has said that the kingdom is the reality and reign of God moving from heaven into the heart within history. The kingdom can be experienced now. However, the full experience of the kingdom is yet to be experienced until Jesus returns in the future to reign. So the message of the kingdom was Jesus' focus of his ministry. And the kingdom was at hand because the king himself was finally here. He had arrived, and a new era, or shall we say, a new exodus had begun. So who would Jesus recruit to help him on this mission and this new exodus adventure? That's where we move to the partnership of fishermen starting in verse 18. Walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. I thought that's what fishermen did. They cast the net into the sea. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Whoa, now there's a difference. And immediately they left their nets and followed him. A little farther, Jesus would find two other brothers, James and John, and he would issue the same command to them, "Follow me." And they would actually immediately leave what they were doing, including their father, which I feel a little bit bad about, that Zebedee was left high and dry. But they would follow Jesus. This kingdom mission, this new Exodus plan would need a little support and some partners. And so Jesus is walking along and he finds these men fishing and he meets them, these common fishermen, on their turf. And he issues this command to follow him, but he puts it and contextualizes it in a way that makes sense to them. He says, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And this "follow me" is a progressive idea. It means keep following me, not just a one-time event. Now, what's unique about this call from Jesus is that this broke the mold of what rabbis usually did. In that time, usually if you wanted to follow a rabbi, you asked him, "Can I follow you?" And he said, "Come along." But here, Jesus initiates the invitation by his grace. Following the rabbi meant living with, learning from him as a teacher about life and truth and purpose. But note that this is not a simple invitation to a party. This is a call and a command to join him on a hard mission, which might explain why he chose fishermen as his first disciples, because they knew what hard work was. It was a command to participate in the new Exodus story. And Jesus tells them that they will become fishers of men. Now, we have to understand that this fishers of men language, this fisherman language, has a lot of levels. And we see once again how Jesus' story and the story of Israel intersects in a way that may not be quite as obvious, but this language actually looks back to a text from the Old Testament in the book of Jeremiah in chapter 16. And this is a lengthy text. I'm going to read it, but there's a purpose to it to show you how this connects to the theme of the new Exodus. Jeremiah 16, 14 through 16. God says, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it shall no longer be said, as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the north country and out of all the countries where he had driven them. For I will bring them back to their own land that I gave to their fathers." Here's verse 16. "Behold, I am sending for many fishers, declares the Lord, and they shall catch them. And afterward I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and every hill and out of the clefts of the rocks." To explain this, we have to understand that there are two images here going on. But what God is promising in the future is a full restoration of a second Exodus back into the promised land for his people who had been scattered into the north country. What is the north country? It is Babylon, which takes us back to our series looking at exile in Babylon. And what happens is that God is actually saying there will be a return from that exile. He then pivots, it's not totally clear as we read it, but he then pivots to say that he is sending fishers and hunters to actually take his people into exile, the exile that they will be futurely drawn out of. And so in this way, Jesus is reversing the story and reversing the role of the fisherman. Scholar Paige H. Kelly writes the following: "When Jesus used the metaphor of fishermen to describe the mission of his disciples, he was reversing its meaning from that intended by Jeremiah. Jeremiah's fishers caught men for judgment. Jesus' fishers caught them for salvation." The exile is now over. The new Exodus has begun because the King is here. And he calls as partners in participating in this great movement common fishermen, not powerful government leaders. And when he calls, their response is immediate. Matthew puts the word immediately in there for both Peter and Andrew and James and John, which is an odd word for Matthew to use. It is a common word for the gospel writer Mark to use. But what Matthew wanted to say in this use of immediately is that Jesus' authority is strongly declared and the disciples' choice was strongly decisive. Almost as if they were waiting for this invitation from Jesus. Jesus' calling has supreme authority, and these men are willing to surrender everything for the call, their life, their vocation, and even their families. And from this point forward in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus would always be surrounded by his disciples until he is abandoned by them in the Garden of Gethsemane. His public ministry has begun. His partnership has been initiated. What would the impact of this ministry be? That's where we turn to the final section of our passage. It would be fame. Verse 23, and he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all of Syria. It's interesting, we move from the inner circle of Jesus to the masses, the crowds, and this summarizes how Jesus' popularity continued to expand and grow. We know that Galilee was primarily a Jewish region, and we know that Jesus' ministry was primarily to the Jews, which is why we read in just the next verse that he taught in the synagogues and gave instruction to them. He met them on their place of gathering and their place of worship. But what Jesus proclaims while he's in a different setting is the same message. He proclaims the gospel of the kingdom. This is the very first use of this word gospel in Matthew's gospel. Is a term for the good news or the announcement that the king has come. The kingdom has come near in and through the person of Jesus Christ. We also read that Jesus healed. The word for healed or healing here is therapeuo, where we get our English word, which makes sense, of therapeutic. He healed diseases and afflictions, sicknesses and demonic oppression. The word for epileptics actually means moonstruck, because the thought back then is if you stared at the moon long enough, you might go crazy and start to convulse. Jesus handled a number of maladies from the simple to the severe. Now that the new Exodus had begun, people who joined the story would be able to find hope and healing in the King, which would include spiritual healing from sin as well as physical healing from sickness. Because Jesus understood that the real problem was the spiritual sickness of sin and not the physical sickness that people experienced. And the initial impact is that his fame spread. And this was all before the wonderful, incredible achievements of social media. Word spread like wildfire to the regions of Syria, which shows that even beyond where Jesus actually was, his fame was spreading. Many people followed him as a result of this. We don't necessarily believe that they followed him as his disciples, but followed him maybe because they were curious. Maybe because they knew he could do something for them and help them. Or maybe because they were suspicious or even threatened by who he proclaimed to be. What we do know is that there was a widespread influence of the ministry of Jesus well beyond where he was even physically located. And again, to show us, because it is so important, you have a second map, where we read that his fame was spread through Galilee in the north, the Decapolis or the 10 cities to the east, Jerusalem, which was central, Judea to the south, and, as the text concludes, again, from beyond the Jordan. So if the main idea this morning is that Jesus journeyed beyond the Jordan so that we could join him and join the story of the new Exodus, what is the application for us to consider about this story? And the application is this. The story of the new Exodus has always been written. Joining the story simply requires faith in the King. Now, you might ask the question, how has this story ever always been written? What we need to do is to examine some of the language of Matthew 4 that connects to Matthew 28 and to Genesis 12 and to Revelation 7. And it looks a little bit like this to show us that all along, God's plan was to include both Jew and Gentile in this community of the new Exodus, leading us out of exile to our sin to hope and life in him. When we read in Matthew 4:15 that Jesus' ministry began in Galilee of the Gentiles, the Greek word for Gentiles is ton ethnon, which means the nations. It's like our word ethnic or ethnicity. At the end of Matthew's gospel, we read in the Great Commission that Jesus' disciples are told to go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Panta ta ethne, same word. Now, if we go to Genesis, it should be Genesis chapter 22 in the Greek language, but this is the word that we read. I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring. This is God's promise to Abraham. From the stars of the heavens and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. All the nations, panta ta ethne, which is the same exact phraseology in Matthew 28 in the Great Commission. So this is a Greek translation of Genesis 22 of the Hebrew. And we find that Matthew is drawing a direct connection to show that the blessing of Abraham, which was meant to go to all the nations, was meant for all the nations. This great new Exodus story was meant to include people from every tribe and tongue, which is where we now find a connection to the very end of the story in Revelation 7:9, where John writes, after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, pantos ethnos, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. So we have to understand, from the beginning of God's story to the end, we can see that the new Exodus, which will lead us out of exile to sin, into this blessed kingdom under the reign of Jesus the King, who journeyed beyond the Jordan, is a story and an experience that both Jew and Gentile alike were always meant to take part in this new community known as the church. I hope you can see how Israel's story and Jesus' story and our story all connect as we learn that story and live that story and listen to that story and share that story as well. The response on our part is simple: to believe. Another word the Bible uses here is to repent. To change our minds of moving away from God and his kingdom to moving towards him in a life that is reoriented towards him in faith. And the invitation is always available to us. It always has been, and it always will be. He came and he journeyed beyond the Jordan so that you and I might move from being in darkness, in the shadow of death and our sin, to find life and light and forgiveness in him.
Thank you for joining us today. Here at the Williamsburg Community Chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. So wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we hope you will join us this year as we study the biblical theme of exile and learn how to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land.